Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this very interesting session on implementing ISO 17100 for translation services. This session is brought to you by Confederation of Interpreting, Translation and Localization Businesses, or CITLoB in short, a true representative body of language professionals in South Asia, along with Association of Translation Companies, ATC in short, based out of United Kingdom. The session will be conducted by Raisa McNab, CEO of ATC and an industry expert on this subject. She will be sharing valuable insights and practical guidance on meeting the ISO 17100 requirements, overcoming the implementation challenges, and achieving the certification. As a CEO of ATC, Raisa steers the Association of Translation Companies, representing the voice of over 220 language services companies, providing translation, interpreting, and other language services to clients across the UK and the world. As ATC's CEO, Raisa's focus is on supporting a community of language service companies, collaborating with external stakeholders on best practice, policy, and sustainable development of the language services industry. She is also the association's lead on standards, overseeing the operations and development of the ATC certification. Raisa is an experienced language services production, training, and quality manager. She holds an MA in translation and interpreting from her native Finland. On the housekeeping front, we will request all the guests to keep themselves on mute and videos on, please. This will hugely assist us and encourage us to deliver our best. And remember, please share your questions in the chat, which we will take up at the end of the session. Over to you, Raisa.
Great, thank you, Sudin, and thank you for joining me this afternoon or early evening on an introduction to ISO 17100 translation services. You already heard about me and my background in this area. In short, I've been involved with ISO 17100 and translation services ISO implementation for many years now. I worked in one of the language service companies who were the early adopters of ISO 17100 in 2007 and 8. So I've implemented ISO 17100 in a language service company then, but also earlier implementing and being certified to the European standard EN 15038 that superseded this ISO 17100 standard. So today we'll talk about the requirements around 17100 and translation services, how to get certified, what that process entails, and what are the frequently asked questions around these standards and the pitfalls that I have seen in my experience with language service companies implementing this particular standard. I won't be talking throughout the entire hour, but we'll take about half an hour to go through my slides first and set the scene. And then we will open the chat and the microphones for your questions and conversations. So Sudin and the CITLoB team will be monitoring the chat. So if there's anything urgent for me to answer straight away, please do just interrupt me and we'll deal with any burning questions and then also leave time at the end for the conversation and the Q&A. So ISO 17100 is one of the first language service specific standards to come out of ISO. So it is an international requirement standard. ISO 17100 dates back to 2015, but it is very similar and was born out of the earlier European standard EN 15038. And as an international standard, ISO 17100 is purely concerned on translation services. So it provides requirements for the core processes and resources and other aspects necessary for the delivery of a quality translation service that meets applicable specifications, which usually normally means whatever your client's specifications are. And the elements that 17100 contains that we'll be talking about today are translator, reviewer, revisor, project manager, competencies and qualifications, and then the translation process itself, plus the project management process around it. ISO 17100 is intended for TSPs. That's the term used in the standard. So translation service providers of any shape or size. That means language service companies from, small LSPs to multinational companies, but also individual freelance translators. So here the term TSP refers to anybody providing translation services, including freelancers. There aren't that many across the world of freelancers who've implemented it, but there are some. So this is the core element of 17100. And today we'll be talking about the journey towards implementation and certification. So we'll look at orientation, preparation, implementation, and then finally certification processes. The first thing that I want to highlight here is that because this is an international standard, it isn't publicly available free of charge. So you do, first of all, when you start your ISO journey, acquire the standard. You can buy it from ISO directly at the ISO online store or from your national standards authority, wherever you are. If your company is an ATC member or a member of another association that works with the ISO and maintains these standards, you can also get access through the library section of your association. So if you're an ATC member, we maintain an ATC ISO library because we're actively involved in the development of these standards. And then what you need to do is, instead of just relying on webinars or hearsay or other people's opinions on what the standard has, you do need to read the full standard through your ISO lenses. And by ISO lenses, what I really mean here is that ISO standards are very particular pieces of documentation. And so there are certain ways of expressing requirements within these requirement standards. And when you read through the standards through your ISO lenses, you must at the same time think about how you will be able to demonstrate how you meet the requirement. And this is the first hurdle or challenge for language service companies quite often in implementing any ISO standards. Quite often our processes are already of a very high quality. We already do a lot of the things that are required by the standards. But if we're unable to demonstrate and showcase how we meet the requirements, it's not enough just to do it. So you must be able to demonstrate how you meet the requirements, and you must also document what is required to be documented. So again, it's not enough just to do what's required, but if there is a documentation requirement, you must also have that documentation. And the standard will tell you what needs to be demonstrated and what needs to be documented. The second important thing when you're thinking about ISO standards and implementation through your ISO lenses is the ISO jargon that you can find in every ISO standard. There are different verb forms that mean very distinct different things. So where the ISO standard says shall, it denotes a requirement. So you must do that. There's no option. Where the ISO standard says should, that denotes a recommendation. So this is best practice, but it isn't absolutely required for you to do it. May denotes a permissible action and can denotes a possibility. So at the same time, the ISO standards are requirement standards that say shall, you must do this, but they are also best practice. This is where the bar is set for best practice delivery of services through should and may and can. And you must keep this in mind when you read the documentation and when you look at what you need to implement as you are working through your ISO standard processes. So that's to start with. And now let's delve further into 17100 specifically. So what's in it? In every single ISO standard, of course, there is a fairly large section on terms and definitions that ensures that we all mean the same thing when we talk about certain things. So later on, we'll look at a couple of terms which are very different from different language service traditions. So here, ISO will tell us what's what. In 17100, there are also a couple of other very specific sections. Resources, of course, human resources, translators, interpreters, project managers, and so on, and the technical resources that you need for this quality delivery of translation services under 17100. And then we have 3 production phases. We've got pre-production processes and activities. So what happens before the actual translation process starts? Production processes, translation, revision, project management around that as well, and post-production processes. What happens once the translation is ready? And then in the 17100, we also have a host of different annexes. So their annexes here aren't normative, so they're not requirements, but they are there to facilitate your implementation journey. So we've got an annex on translation workflows, agreements and project specifications, project registration and reporting, pre-production tasks, translation technologies, and value-added services. Value-added services is an interesting one, and I'll use a minute here to loop back into the scope of the standard itself. So 17100 is only concerned with translation services. So it's not like your quality management standard ISO 9001, which is an umbrella standard for all of your company's operations. 17100 is for translation services. But besides 17100 compliant, implemented, certified services, you can, as a language service company, of course, sell and produce whatever else you want to. And this is the question that I continue having in the profession, in that even if you implement and get certified to 17100, that does not mean that you can only do and only sell translation work. Of course, as language service companies, and even more today than ever before, we've got a host of different types of language services. For 17100, we're in the translation services bucket. So let's now loop back into this idea of terms and definitions, and to ensure that we mean the same thing when we talk about the terms and refer them with the terms defined in the ISO standard. So translation is self-explanatory, and we understand what we mean by that. 17100 also has this term check to follow the translation process itself. Check here means the examination of target language content by a translator. So it is essentially the translator's self-revision, is a term that I would have used earlier. This is a requirement in the translation process, so it must be done. Another requirement is revision. So bilingual examination of the target language content against source language content by a reviser. This is quite often a term that we mix and match a lot. So revision is the term used in ISO 17100, but quite often, especially in the US, we hear the term proofreading. Now, you can in your operations use whatever terms you like, but in ISO 17100, revision is the term for second reading of the translation against the target by another qualified and competent linguist. These two, translation and revision, are merits apart from the external value-added services that you may or may not want to tag on. We have review and proofreading. Review here is a monolingual examination of target language content for its suitability for the agreed purpose. In the industry, we quite often talk about review as subject matter expert review. And in some cases, like for example, pharmaceutical translation, it's always part of the process, but in others, not at all. So you can include that in the process or you can leave it out. The same with proofreading. And here, proofreading means reading of proofs. So post DTP examination of revised target language content before the actual printing, typically. So you can provide that as a service or you can leave it out. Another key term, which is slightly different to maybe what we're used to, is verification. So this is a mandatory requirement. Verification is the confirmation by the project manager that specifications have been fulfilled. So these are key terms that I wanted to bring out into the open because there is so many different types of terms that we hear and see in the industry. The typical term that we also see quite often is TEP, translation, edit, proof. Here, the equivalent of TEP would be translation, followed by the translator's own check, and then revision, typically. So let's move on now to human resources. And here we start seeing the elements of shall, so the mandatory requirements. The TSP shall have a documented process in place to ensure that the people selected to perform translation tasks have the required competencies and qualifications. It's obvious. Of course, we want to use qualified and competent translators. This is where this idea of how do we demonstrate that our linguists, translators, and revisers are qualified and competent come into play. We'll come back to the competencies and qualifications later. So here, you must have a documented process that tells you and the auditor and anybody else interested how your linguists, your translators and revisers and project managers fulfill this requirement of having appropriate competencies and qualifications. So how do you know that they are competent and qualified? It's not enough that you just know or that you've been working with them for 20 years. You've got to have a documented process and follow that process. The same with continued professional development, or CPD, which is not a term used in 17100, but instead in 17100, we've got a requirement for the TSP to keep a record of the evidence upon which professional competencies have been demonstrated. So how do you know that your people are qualified and competent? How do you demonstrate that? Have you documented that? How do you record the evidence of continued professional development? These are key elements in human resources. And the third key element in 17100 is this full responsibility for subcontracted tasks. And what that means in the scope of 17100 is that regardless of whether you work with internal in-house linguists or freelance suppliers or other language service companies, everybody within the supply chain must fulfill the same qualification, competence and process requirements. And it's your responsibility as the organization that's certified to ISO 17100 to ensure that everybody does that. And what follows out of that is that, of course, you need to have a mechanism to know that they do. So you need to consider that when you start your implementation journey. In 17100, one of the other big hurdles or question marks that I've found is this idea of translator competencies and also qualifications. In the previous iteration, so the European standard, the original one, the wording was slightly different. So there was a requirement for qualifications, and competencies, but you could have showcased the competencies through the qualifications, i.e., I've got a master's degree in translation, therefore I am a competent and qualified translator. In ISO 17100, competencies and qualifications are equally important and separate sections in the standard. So we start with these competencies. Translators shall, again, have the following competencies: translation competence, linguistic and textual competence in the source and target languages, competence in research, information acquisition and processing, cultural competence, technical competence, domain competence. Again, it's a given that you want to work with people with these competencies, but because it's a shall, you need to be able to demonstrate and showcase how do you know that the people you work with have these competencies. There is nothing in the standard that tells you how you know. You need to know, and you need to be able to demonstrate that. So there are different mechanisms that you can use, which I can maybe give you an idea of, but I can't require you to do. So it's up to you to look at your own operations and figure out what is the best way for your operations, your company to showcase this. So some of the mechanisms that you can use, for example, is to use test translations, right? So you test the freelancers that you work with to ensure that they have the right competencies to produce a good quality translation. You might have a quality control mechanism whereby every 10th or every high risk translation is revised by somebody else who reviews these competencies and provides feedback. Whatever it is, you need to have some kind of a mechanism that allows you to demonstrate how you comply, how your people comply to these competence requirements. Technical competence, for example, of course, is going to be related to the use of CAT tools or other translation technology tools. And you could conceivably say, well, if I work with this translator, they've got the CAT tool that I need. They're able to produce a translation in the CAT tool. I get it back, and it hasn't broken the translation. The translator has got the technical competence that I need. That's the first hurdle in terms of the human resources for the translators themselves. And then, of course, we have the qualifications. Again, here, this is a requirement, shall. The TSP shall determine the translator's qualifications by obtaining documented evidence that the translator can meet the following criteria. And we've got three options here: a degree in translation, linguistics, or language studies, or an equivalent degree that includes significant translation training from a recognized institution of higher education, or a degree in any other field from a recognized institution of higher education, plus the equivalent of 2 years full-time professional experience in translating, or the equivalent of 5 years of full-time professional experience in translating, right? In other words, these are the qualifications requirements. If you want to sell translation work that is compliant to 17100, your linguists must meet these criteria, or one of the three criteria. You must be able to demonstrate how this criteria is obtained. So typically, you're going to see the translator's degree certificate. You're going to have references from the translator's other clients, for example, on the work that they have done. You will probably have data on the translator's experience within your own databases if you've worked with the translator earlier. So there are different mechanisms of verifying this. There is no one size fits all solution, and the standard does not tell you how to demonstrate or what exactly the documented evidence should be. And this is also typical of all ISO standards. So the ISO standard tells you what you should achieve, but not how you're going to get there, because the ISO standard needs to be applicable to all sorts of different shapes and sizes of organizations. And that's why it cannot tell you how to fulfill it. It just tells you what needs to be fulfilled. If you've got any questions on the qualifications, which you very well may, we can come back to this section later on in the Q&A session. So that was the translator qualifications. And then, of course, we've got the very same for the revisor and the reviewer competencies. So revisors must have the same competencies and qualifications as the translators, plus translation and or revision experience in the domain under consideration. Reviewers, typically subject matter experts, are domain specialists and have relevant qualification in this domain from an institution of higher learning and or experience in this domain. So reviewers don't need to have the translation experience because typically they are the subject matter experts. Translators, revisors, pretty much on a par. And of course, in the industry, we know that we mix and match. So the same people are translators, and then in the project, they are revisors, and this is totally fine. 17100 also includes competence requirements for project managers. So the people working with the projects must also have the appropriate documented competence to support the translation service provider in delivering translation services to meet specifications. Appropriate competencies can be acquired through formal or informal training. So this is much looser than for the translator qualifications. So we don't have qualification requirements for PMs, but basically the PMs must know what they're doing. And that's where the competencies come in. You can train them. They can have project management training from elsewhere, but they must know what they're doing with project management. And of course, here we have the requirement for CPD, so continuous practice, regular updating of competencies, and a requirement on how that is documented and how the records are kept. So these are the people involved in the processes. And then we go into the processes themselves. I'm not going to go into lots of detail on the processes because the processes around the translation itself and the revision itself are industry standard. What I will say is that, again, here, you may be doing most of the requirements already. It may be that you need to plug in some specific gaps, but wherever the standard has got shall, you must include that in the translation process. So you cannot here define, I'm going to do this, but I'm not going to do that. If the standard says shall, you must be able to do that. But in a nutshell, the pre-production processes and activities in 17100 include requirements for the inquiry and feasibility of a translation project. So the client's first contact, the way that you give quotes to clients, the way you assess whether the project is feasible to carry out or not. Quotation, client TSP agreement. So you've got to have an agreement, of course. How you handle project-related client information, and how you or your project managers prepare the project for translation. So these are all included in much more detail in 17100 pre-production processes and activities. Fairly standard stuff. Production process is, of course, the bigger chunk of the standard. So here within production, we've got requirements on the translation service project management. So how the project managers should manage the process. And then, of course, the translation process itself. So translation is a mandatory part. Translators' own self-revision, so check, is also mandatory, and revision is also mandatory. Review and proofreading are optional, like we said before, and final verification and release to the client are, again, mandatory parts of the process. So again, 17100 includes translation, translator's own check, and revision, the necessary elements around that, and then this idea of final verification, making sure that the translation is ready for delivery to the client and the client's requirements have been met. Again, none of this is rocket science for language service companies. Most already do all of these. Your key challenge is to figure out, how do you ensure compliance, right? How do you know that the translator has followed the steps required in the standard, how do you know that those have been followed? So again, here it's not just enough just to, throw the translation project into the well of the professional translator. Something comes out, you're happy, the client's happy. You need to be able to know, how do you know that the translator has followed the steps? And there are steps to follow within the translation and revision process. So that's the production process. And then we come to the post-production process. And here we've got requirements for handling client feedback, for the assessment of client satisfaction, and for making appropriate corrections and taking corrective action where required. So this idea of continuous improvement and making sure that we implement the client's requirements into the process even after the translation process. And then, of course, we've got a few requirements on closing administration, including invoicing, before we complete the loop of the translation services. So this is the standards requirements in a very small nutshell. All of those will be detailed in the standards requirements, and that's why, of course, you need to read the full standard and match that against your current operations. But I wanted to here pause for the 3 top FAQs that I've been asked over the years. The first one is what we already said, but I want to reiterate that. Not all of your projects need to be ISO 17100 compliant. But if you're certified to 17100, you must be clear about what aren't. So you can't go away and confuse your clients to say everything we do is 17100 compliant. Only work that's been carried out within the parameters of the standard is 17100 compliant, right? You can still sell translation only, you can sell revision only, you can sell whatever you like, as long as you don't deceive your client to think that everything is compliant. What I have found in practice is that even if only a third of your work is 17100 compliant translation and revision, there is still value in the certification, because most of your suppliers are still compliant, competent, and qualified to 17100, even if the client only needs or only has budget for translation only, or even if somebody else has done translation and you're only being asked for revision, right? So there is still value in this process and in raising the bar for all of your operations, even if not everything you do is 17100 compliant translation and revision. Another top FAQ is whether translators need to be native speakers. No, they don't need to be native speakers, but they do have to have the right qualifications and competencies. I've got a master's degree in English and French translation with Finnish, which is my native tongue. I translate into English because there aren't enough native English speaking translators to translate from Finnish into English. And, we've got a very complex language landscape in India as well. So you don't need to be native speaker, but you've got to be qualified and competent to translate between the languages. And the third big thing is that the way you ensure, demonstrate, and document compliance around the competencies, qualifications, and CPD requirements should match your operations. So you don't need to have a 150-page long quality control documentation if you're a 5-person operation. You need to know what good looks like for you, and you need to figure out what's enough for your operational purposes. And that's why every single language service company has got a slightly different way of ensuring compliance. So you really need to go and look into your own operations and figure out what's right for you. So these were the 3 top FAQs, and we'll very quickly look through what next. The first stage is in implementation is a gap analysis. So you carry out a gap analysis of your processes and documentation against the standards requirements. What's already there, what's missing. Number 2, you might also want to consider what other standards may naturally fit within this process and whether you should implement them at the same time. We're not going to go into the MTP standard 18587, but that is a natural fit to 17100 if you do those operations. Then you implement missing processes and documentation, which may take anything from 3 to 6 months to a year, depending on the standard that you're implementing and the gaps that you need to address and the resources that you've got available to put into this process. Then you ensure everyone is aware of their roles and responsibilities, because implementing an ISO standard is not just the quality manager's business, it's everyone's business, because everyone is involved in the process of delivering the services. And then you're ready for certification. So I've been working with our certification processes at ATC Certification. This is what our process looks like. And I'll leave this on whilst we have the queries. In short, there are different types of auditing and certification processes. Typically, the certification runs on a 3-year cycle. So year 1 is your certification audit, which typically is in 2 stages. Stage 1 for review of your documentation. Stage 2, the auditor comes to you virtually or in person to make sure that you basically do what you said in your documentation that you do. And then the process carries through certification, audit, and committee decision. You get granted the certification, which is valid for 3 years, but every single year you need to pass a surveillance audit. So the auditor comes back to you to make sure that you still continue to do what you said you do, and you still continue to comply with the standards requirements. That's the easy part, provided that you've done all of the preparation and you understand what you're doing and you really thought about your processes and what works for you. There we go. And now we open the floor for your questions and comments.
Great.
And see what's in the chat.
Yes. So I'll just read out one question that has come.
Yep.
Very specifically India-centered question. So this is Monica Mohan asking, in some countries like India, there is no standard course for translation that resources have. They usually have specific language qualification, but not a direct translation course.
Yep.
So typically in India, you have qualifications like MA or BA in a particular language, Indian language. Now, in such cases, are these degrees equivalent to translation courses required? That's a question.
In these cases, so when we're purely talking about language degrees, you need to look into what that degree contains. So you don't necessarily have to have, and let's go back now. Sorry, I'm going to go back into my qualification slide so that we can match that here. So you don't, to fulfill the first part, degree in translation, linguistics, or language studies, you can have that if it includes significant translator training. So you need to look into, in these cases, you need to look into the qualification and see what it's actually eaten, because quite a lot of the language courses still have modules on translation, practical translation practice. So if you can showcase that, then you're probably happy that that person has got the qualifications to work as a professional translator, because of course that's the risk there, that if it's somebody with a language degree with no understanding or experience in translation, they probably can't do the job without, significant practice. So you first see what the degree has eaten. If there is no significant, and by the way, significant has not been defined, so I can't tell you what that actually means. It's up to you to figure that out, sorry. But if there is none there, then we fall back to the second point, which would be a degree in any other field plus 2 years of professional experience in translation.
Excellent. So I just a question along with this is, how does a certified translation fit in this whole thing? How does ISO look at certified translation or certified translators?
Certified translators, as in kind of state authorized sworn translators.
That's right.
From the qualifications point of view.
That's right. How does, let's say, for example, somebody has a state, certificate that says he's a, recognized translator in a, let's say, particular language
Yeah.
pair. How does that fit in this translator qualification?
It doesn't.
It doesn't? Okay.
No.
Okay.
And another, point of contention is also that what's required here in 17100 is a qualification from a recognized institution of higher education. And that's why also qualifications from, let's take the UK's ITI, Institute for Translation and Interpreting. If you pass their examination, that's an examination by a membership organization, so it's not a qualification. Whereas we've got the Chartered Institute of Linguists who actually do a professional level 7 MA equivalent qualification that we've included. So there is no option to replace the qualification requirement by a sworn translator, state authorized, stamped, whatever we want to call it. Let's not call it qualification here because it's slightly different. However, if you've got somebody who's passed a formal test examination and been awarded state authorized sworn translator status, that's probably a very high indication that they've got the competencies required. It's very complex, and I'm sorry, is the translator qualification section is the most hotly debated topic in ISO 17100 across the years. It's a compromise. This is where the bar has been set. And that means that some qualifications like the state authorized, unless it's got a degree attached to it, does not feature in here. Silvina comments there, to be sworn translator, you need a university diploma in Argentina in the translation field, for example. Exactly. So here we've got, the diploma is a prerequisite for the sworn translator. And in this case, the diploma would fall into this qualifications box. This is simply because there are so many different types of sworn state authorized systems in the world that it would be impossible to map all of them into here. So it's a compromise solution, but a good question, Sudhin.
So one interesting always question is how important is it for freelance professionals to know about ISO 17100?
Freelance professionals who typically work with language service companies don't necessarily need to know all the ins and outs of the ISO standard. However, because they are the people carrying out the work, they need to understand why you're asking them for their qualifications. They need to know why they need to maybe fill in some checklists to ensure that they've done what they need to do in the translation process. They need to know what they need to do in the translation process in order for you to know that they have completed the translation or revision process according to the requirements of the standard. So because they are such an integral part of your supply chain and of your compliance to the standard, my recommendation, and this is not a requirement in the standard, but my recommendation is that you do let them know and you bring them in as part of this entire process, which is so critical to the quality of your operations anyway. And you explain to them, why have you implemented these ISO standards or this particular one? What does it bring to you? what do you require from your suppliers because you're ISO 17100 certified, and to use that also as a mechanism to showcase your commitment to high quality translation processes and high quality operations. That's what I've done in the past, and that's a really powerful way to tie your suppliers closer to you, but also showcase why you're asking them to do what you're asking them to do.
Very well. Well, I just asked this question because this has been something during our conversation with freelance professionals. They say like it is purely ISO 17000 is only for translation service provider companies, and not for really professionals like who are freelancers and who work with us, or even individual freelancers. So right at the onset, you clearly said that there are many translators who have got certificates for 17100. That's news to me. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's news. Okay, that's something that probably can be an ideal situation, or maybe an example for other freelance translators to follow.
Yeah. And the freelance translators typically who've implemented the standard and been certified are ones who work with direct clients. So just to be clear, the freelancers that you as a language service company work with don't have to be certified to the standard. They need to have the competencies and qualifications, and they need to tick the boxes of having done the bits of the translation process. They don't need to be certified. Similarly, if you work with other companies as sub-suppliers, they don't need to be certified to the standard. It's easier for you if they are, because they can just share their certificate with you and you're happy that they comply. But if you've got other mechanisms to ensure that they follow the same steps and the same processes and use qualified and competent people, they don't have to be certified to this standard.
Great. This is a question from my side. All this technology and AI coming into translation play, how does 17100 kind of work around this, or how does it take that into account in the process?
Well, 17100 is essentially the same standard as it was in 2015. So it does not say anything about AI enabled services. What it does say is that pure machine translation post editing, MTPE, is out of scope. So you cannot, do MTPE on its own and call that 17100 compliant. However, if you ask me, and this is now my personal experience, opinion, and also ATC certifications recommendation or auditor guidance, in the language services translation process, machine translation, and by extension AI enabled machine translation processes are quite often used as part of the translation process as a productivity tool, a productivity enhancer in a multimodal environment, in the same way as we use CAT tools, right? So in the translation process, the translator is presented with TM matches from a translation memory, which they process. They are presented with machine translation output, raw machine translation output on a segment by segment basis. And then they might have blanks there. So in my view, in ATC certification's view, when you're using machine translation in a multimodal environment where the translator just uses the machine translation suggestions in the same way as TM matches, what comes out the other end is full human translation. If the translator's gone through all of those same processes, and if the translation is then revised, by another fully competent and qualified professional, then that is 17100 compliant. But this is not in this much detail in the standard. This is our recommendation. So you must be happy that if you include MT or AI-enabled services, it must still follow the same process as the full human translation would follow.
Great answer. And I think the way you answered, it shows your grip on multiple standards. So you could probably, you've answered in a way that kind of combines your expertise on multiple standards and of course your experience. Thank you for that answer. And this is a very, complex question that we as translation service providers, we keep facing this. How is that related to this? How can you use technologies? And so thank you for that. Very well, clearly answered.
Yeah.
So, that comes through. So I don't have any more questions. So, okay, let me see if there is any questions in the chat that I've missed out. Well, there was another question from Ritesh, which said review is optional in ISO 17000 process, which Raisa, you re-emphasized a couple of times that yes, review is optional. But revising or reviser is a mandatory requirement.
Yes, yeah, that's right.
So we need to know what a reviser is and what a reviewer is. So these are two similar sounding terms, but one is mandatory and the other is optional.
Yeah.
And of course, I like the way you clearly differentiated between proofreading and TEP proofreading, which was very different in meaning. Though the words are same, but the function is very different in 17100 to the earlier TEP phrase. So the proofreading there meant something different, and here it is very different, and it is not mandatory in 17100. So that's quite interesting. Good. So I don't have any more questions. Any closing notes, Raisa, from your side?
Great. So thank you for having me today. I'm happy to continue the conversation with more webinars or workshops. We haven't looked at many of the other emerging ISO standards. There are others for translation, legal translation standards that just came out last year or the year before, MTP standard as well, that works really well with 17100. But then there are also a host of interpreting standards that you might also be interested in. If you're interested in certification, ATC certification is but one certification body out there, but we do industry expert certification. So many language service companies across the world come to us because our auditors understand what your business is about. So if you're interested, there's more information at atccertification.com. It operates as a separate company from ATC, the association. So thank you for having me today. Thank you, Sadine. It's a pleasure always to join CITLoB in these events.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Raisa, for the wonderful presentation. And I'm speaking from all of us here. I would like to say that this session was very insightful and a huge learning experience. I can't thank you enough for your consistent effort to share knowledge and experiences with us. So many years of knowledge and experiences, I think it's really invaluable for the industry. And personally, I think you're doing a wonderful job of giving back to the profession and the industry.
Thank you.
And yes, we look forward to seeing you at the Ethical Business Summit in London in September. And I encourage all the guests here to not miss this opportunity to attend this conference in London. That's happening on September 21 and 22. It's unique in the sense that it's a joint effort by ATC and EU ATC. So you will find a large congregation of language industry stakeholders there. Well, that's about it. So thank you very much, all of you again, for joining us. And thank you very much once again, Raisa. I wish you all the best for the evening, and see you next time. And
Great.
please do join us for the next
Thank you so much,
session.
sir.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.